And here's what I found. Consequences in my life of pride were challenging. And I was in business with my dad. And when you're an auctioneer and you get in an argument, to win the argument, you kick up the volume a notch and you're going to win. You ought to go to auctioneer conventions. It's hilarious. You know, it's so loud. But that's how I handled it with my dad. That's the way I was taught. Just give an emotional speech and irrefutable facts and kick it up the volume and you win the argument. So, man, after years of doing that, I go to my uncle, who's my dad's brother. And I said, I got a problem. And I told him the story, and I figured he'll know because he grew up with the guy. And he says, why don't you focus on Christ? Why don't you humble your heart to Christ? And not the circumstances. I said, what? He said, why don't you? I said, you want me to literally picture Jesus when he's yelling at me and pushing my hot buttons? Yes. Come on. So I'm going to do that fake it till you make it kind of thing. And I'll never forget it. We were standing in my dad's office. He has just pushed the hot buttons with me. And I am ready to lay out this beautiful speech at a high volume with irrefutable facts. And he will know there is a God at Cruise International. Well, anyway, I remember what my uncle said. And I stopped. And I thought, oh, boy, okay. I'm going to picture Christ. And I kind of go to extremes. So I was reading Proverbs. I was reading a chapter in Proverbs, still do. Every day. So you go through Proverbs every month. And Proverbs 15:1, you ought to write this down. Proverbs 15:1 says this: a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So I went to extremes. I thought, I'm not just going to be like gentle and soft. I'm going to give him a compliment. So I'll never get, he's pushing the hot buttons. He's kind of raising his voice. He's getting kind of yelling at me. And I am an adult when this is happening. I am bald. And I said, Dad, you are one of the most gifted human beings I know. And he really is. I said, you are the most gifted human beings I know. What'd you say? See, still to this day, when I pay my dad a compliment, he wants to hear it again. My brother and I laugh about it. And, you know, a lot of people are that way. You know, they don't get encouragement, so they want to hear that. That's really what they want to hear. And he goes, what'd you say? And I repeated it to him. And I got to tell you, that changed conflict with my dad immensely. That changed the way conflict was handled in other relationships with me in my home immensely. But James says, you know, time is short. I'm not in control. He says in verse 14 that we're just a mist. Our life is just a vapor. Anybody ever go up, raise your hand if this is true, you ever go up to a mirror or to a glass window on a bus or a window in the car when you're a kid and go, raise your hand if you did it. All right, just want to know we're tracking. How many of you wrote something in the, all right. How many of you wrote your name? All right. Well, here's the deal James is saying. That's the breath of God that he talks about in Genesis 2 that gives life to every human being. It's mentioned in Acts 10. But what God's doing is writing his name on your heart in that mist, if you let him. That's what's going on. And he writes his name. But we're a mist. We don't know when it's going to end. And James says, so cut out the boasting, cut out the pride. About the same time I did the Proverbs 15:1 thing, I did the Jeremiah 9:23, 9:24 memorization and tried to live it. Let not the wise man boast of his wisdom. Let not the strong man boast of his strength. Let not the rich man boast of his riches, but let him who boasts, if you're going to boast that you know and that you understand, you experience, and you have this relationship with God. And I just want to ask you in your conflict today, and that conflict that you're picturing, do you know him? Do you experience God in your conflict? Because James closes out the deal in verse 17, that the sin of omission in conflict, you got to watch that. Because guys, you know what to do here. Because James has talked about the Spirit of God in you, because he's talked about the grace of Christ, that greater grace than any pride or conflict you have, because of Romans 1 and 2, that it's written on your conscience and it's written in creation, not one person here can say, I don't know. You're accountable. As Billy Graham would say, you're accountable today because you heard this message. It's become clear. Now, are you going to continue to harden your heart and keep it locked up to the God of the universe? Or are you going to humble yourself to Jesus Christ and let him unlock peace and love in you? See, you know the good you ought to do. And so in conflict, humility sees the truth and chooses to receive truth. Pride sees that same truth and chooses to deny it. And that might be what you're doing right now. Does your faith offer humility and peace in your heart, in your relationship with others, in your relationship with God? Are you open? Do you ask questions? You notice how proud people, they don't ask. They just talk. Or do you ask? Do you listen? Are you pliable? James summed it up so beautifully in James 1:19. Are you quick to listen? Are you slow to speak in conflict? Are you slow to anger in conflict? See, you have that opportunity right now. The breath of God. You're missed. You don't know when it's going to end on this side. And he's writing his name on your heart. Time is short. The cause of conflict is pride. The consequences of conflict are three-dimensional. In me, with God, with others. We're killing people. The cure is Jesus Christ, the mystery of the both and. Humility toward Christ because God humbled himself in Christ. The mystery of the both and. And the change is peace or reconciliation, wisdom for relationships. I just want to ask you right now, what two worlds are attempting to fit in the same space at the same time in your heart? Is it your husband and another relationship with another man? Is it your wife and a relationship with another woman? Is it your wife and the internet? Is it your use of drugs and then I let everybody see that I'm also studying the Bible? Are you lying on expense reports and praying to God for answers to your pleasure? Are you cheating on a test and pretending to worship on Sunday, students? Do you have an unhealthy addiction and yet pretend to let God fill that vacuum? Is it the mockery, the absolute mockery of receiving forgiveness and not issuing it? Is it the audacity to have reconciliation with God without reconciliation with someone you have offended or someone who has offended you? Maybe your job, maybe your family, maybe with God. The cycle's the same. The cause is pride. The consequences are three-dimensional. The cure for the conflict is full surrender to Jesus Christ in humility. And the change you'll experience is wisdom, is peace, is reconciliation. Let real faith in Jesus Christ reconcile your conflict today. Kelly Bird has modeled humility in my life. Can you imagine a guy in his position letting me speak like this? I've spent a lot of time with a lot of pastors. He's unique. He's a humble man. I've never seen humility exhibited in conflict quite the way that I've seen it in Steve Longbreak. I've never seen someone so willing to admit when he's wrong. Someone to say a statement and then admit afterwards, you know, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And to do that all the time, to live that out with students. These guys have modeled humility in my life. It's really interesting. You know, I want to ask you to come to Christ if you don't know him today. If you got conflict in your life, and maybe it's had good conflict, I want you to hear this. Paul wrote this. In 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. He didn't like the conflict. He didn't like the thorn in the side. Paul didn't. And he says, but God says to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Humility. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. Church, if we would do this, we'd change the world. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.